Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on NASHIA's 2023 calendar entitled Intimate Partner Violence and Brain Injury, a panel discussion offered by the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators. We appreciate you joining us. I'm Maria Crowley, NASHIA's Director of Professional Development, and I will be your moderator today. Should you have any issues with today's webinar, you can send us a chat through Zoom or go to Zoom's support site. Closed captioning is available by enabling it at the bottom of your viewing window. Questions for the presenters can be added to the Q&A in your viewing window, or you can place those in the chat and we'll address those questions at the end of our presentation. In case you're not familiar with us, NASHIA is a nonprofit organization created to assist state government in promoting partnerships and building systems to meet the needs of individuals with brain injury and their families. We're also a member organization and offer several membership categories. Please view our website for all the options, and you can always email us with any questions you may have there. And also, general certificates of attendance and social work CEs are available for today's event. These are free for NASHIA members. You'll receive an email tomorrow or later today, even with a link for the general feedback form. There's also a link in that email for certificates of attendance. If you're a member, contact me for your complimentary certificate promo code. The certificate, the evaluation links, as well as the recording and the materials from today's webinar will be available on our site later. For viewers of the recording, please go to Trainings on Demand to find information on how to obtain the certificates. So I'd like to introduce to you today's session and our presenters. We're really going to delve into some background and some recent research related to mild brain injuries among women who've been victimized by intimate partners through the work that these two women have been focused on. They're going to share their findings with you, talk a little bit about implications for screening, case management, and service navigation that'll support survivors of intimate partner abuse. First, we have Dr. Anda Prince. She's a University of Denver professor. She's also a clinical psychologist and an expert in trauma and intimate violence. She authored something you may not have yet read that's on my to-read list called Every 90 Seconds, Our Common Cause Ending Violence Against Women, and champions community university collaboration for public problem solving, and received the U.S. Department of Justice's Vision 21 Crime Victims Research Award for her contributions to the nation's understanding of crime victims. Very impressive. Dr. Kim Gorgans is also a professor of psychophysiology, clinical neuropsychology, and psychology of criminal behavior at the University of Denver. She's board certified in rehab psychology and is the current president of the American Psychological Association's Division on Rehab Psychology. She manages a large portfolio of TBI-related research, and you may have seen her on one of her lectures during one of the 2 TED Talks that she conducted, or on NPR, or the interview she did on CNN with Anderson Cooper. Her work has been featured in U.S. News, Newsweek, and The Economist. Welcome to you both. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having us and for that generous introduction. We are really excited to be here today, and I have the pleasure of getting to kick things off a bit. Kim and I are going to bounce back and forth to share some information with you today that we're really excited about. I'm going to start and give you a bit of a sense of what to expect from us. We wanted to offer you a little bit of background into how we came to collaborate. A clinical psychologist focused on trauma and a neuropsychologist. It sounds like the start of a really boring joke, but it actually, no joke, has led to some important and exciting work, we think. And we're going to feature some of that work, so draw on some of our Colorado-based studies. And then we love to talk a little bit about some of the implications that we're seeing as we open things up to question and discussion and comments from folks attending today. So without further ado, we will kick that off. And I wanted to start in part to point out that brain injury, as you all are working on these issues across the country in your communities, of course, has many consequences that overlap with what I was studying before I started really considering brain injury from a trauma perspective. That those of us focused on intimate violence, intimate partner abuse, domestic violence, we've been working for a long time, over many decades, noticing how intimate violence is linked with a host of problems, whether it's memory disruption, problems with academic performance, interpersonal consequences, such as relationship difficulties or re-victimization, disruptions in attention, psychological distress, whether it's suicidality or depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, and also difficulty accessing resources. And so for folks such as myself from a trauma background, one way to put this puzzle together is to recognize that there are dynamics within interpersonal violence that we can use to explain these kinds of outcomes. But what we have started to realize is by focusing on more of the psychological and the interpersonal dynamics, we might be missing a very obvious additional pathway to these sort of consequences, which is what Kim and I have been teaming up to better understand. And that is the degree to which intimate violence often can involve blows to the head or strangulation that may result in the exact same puzzle, the exact same picture of consequences. Attention and memory problems, affect dysregulation, changes in one's awareness of self and others. And then an additional layer, which you all are very familiar with, of course, in the ways that daily activities can be impacted after as a consequence of brain injuries. So coming at this through a trauma lens, many years ago, I started asking Kim and others and looking out at the literature and trying to understand just how common are brain injuries. And I know that this is the world you navigate. And so I'll be brief here, but we wanted to give you a bit of the narrative of to understand where the work has taken us. And of course, we know that somewhere in the ballpark, depending on the study, of about 1 in 10 folks across the US and the general adult population have experienced a mild brain injury. And I was doing a project at the time with the police department and DA's office and some victim service providers in and around Denver, Colorado. And we took the opportunity to do a brief screener in that project, which we call the triage project, to look at try to identify the number of women who indicated that at some point in their lifetimes, they had blow to the head that was so severe as to result in an alteration in consciousness or seeking medical care, or alteration in consciousness. More than 1 in 2 women told us about some injury across their lifetimes, and an additional almost 20% of women told us about emergency room care, even though they didn't report an alteration in consciousness. And for that early work, we were using what has become a really common measure identification tool, screening tool in the domestic violence world, the HELPS, which looks at have people hit their head or been hit on the head? Were they ever seen in an emergency room? Did they lose consciousness or have a period of being dazed or confused? And do they have some persistent problems tied to that? And that HELPS tool, because of that persistent problem piece, we also, in that early work, tried to understand the kinds of symptoms that women were saying they connected to that injury whenever it occurred in their lives. I'm sure not surprising to you, we heard a lot about things such as headaches, trouble remembering things, difficulty finding the right words, trouble concentrating. Now, this is, of course, the kind of bread and butter sort of consequences that you're grappling with in your work. And what was impactful for us from a perspective of trying to think about people navigating the victim service world is just how challenging it would be to understand how to navigate the court system, to be taken seriously, to have your story believed. If you're having difficulty telling what happens, concentrating or focusing in highly stressful environments, such as, being asked to show up to testify in court. And so this early work was very impactful in how we were grappling on our research team with questions of access to justice and again, navigation of many social services, but and also the criminal justice system. It turns out that our work, that early work, is in line with what is emerging nationally. There's was a recent review that identified more than 40 studies that have been looking primarily in emergency settings at rates of positive screens for potential mild brain injuries. Depending on the samples, those studies range from anywhere from 20 to 75% of women reporting some kind of blow to the head. Studies have varied. Ours asked about lifetime. Some of these studies have focused in on injuries specific to the domestic violence. In our work, many of the instances of of head injuries that women reported were tied to domestic violence, but some weren't. They also reported other causes of the injury, such as motor vehicle or bike accidents or medical traumas. We on my team got really interested in this missing piece for trauma psychologists, and that we tend to see a lot through the lens of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so one of the areas we've started to investigate with those early data was to try to understand how much do the kinds of problems that women are describing tied to the brain injury overlap with post-traumatic stress disorder. And is it just one sort of bucket of problems? Or are there ways to understand different kinds of difficulties that women may have, or groups that they might fall into? Like, is there a path forward to understand, especially when we think about limited resources, different ways that the kinds of consequences of brain injury might manifest? And so I wanted to just highlight here some preliminary work that a graduate student who's now graduated, and now Dr. Naomi Wright was leading, to look at these data and try to step back and say, instead of carving people up from the start into groups, what happens when we take the various symptoms and severity that people report? Are there natural ways that people's experiences cluster? And what Naomi found in this preliminary work is that we do see different patterns, that there are some women who are telling us about a combination of PTSD symptoms as well as the symptoms that show up on that HELPS screener. There's some people who are telling us about primarily PTSD symptoms and not a lot that ties to the more broader dysregulation assessed by the HELPS. There's a group that's pulling the pieces that they report from PTSD and from the HELPS measure really are at their core about kind of cognitive dysregulation, so memory and attention problems, but maybe not the more affect sorts of symptoms. And then it's important to remember that there's a group of women who really weren't reporting any symptoms. And this has been a pressing issue for Kim and I to begin to try to understand together, that as we're doing more universal work to try to identify brain injuries, trying to really think about who needs and would benefit from additional supports, because there seem to be groups of women where that may not be necessary or helpful. So I'm going to tee up some of the work that we have been doing more recently, Kim and I, and then turn the reins over to her. Building on that work I described that was in collaboration with the police department after women had incidents of domestic violence reported to law enforcement, Kim and I, with our colleague Julia Dimitrieva, and in partnership with a terrific organization in Denver called the Rose Andom Center. That is a family justice center that's a one-stop shop for services after domestic violence. We wanted to understand how frequently were women coming through the door to seek services at the Rose Andom Center with a history of brain injury, and how severe were the kinds of consequences that they were experiencing, and were those consequences linked with difficulty getting services, particularly health services, met? So we've been collaborating with the Rosandom Center on various projects and are highlighting one here. And just a caveat that these findings are preliminary. We're confident in what we're sharing with you, but we're still working on sort of the final products out of this project. In this project, we also took the opportunity to say, what happens when we look at an identification tool such as the HELPS, but then also take a deeper dive and more time with women to talk through the kinds of injuries they may have experienced using a tool such as the Ohio State University TBI identification method. So that tool, many of you may be familiar with it, and Kim will hop in and talk more about it as we go, because she has been one of the collaborators working nationally to continue to develop and improve this tool. But it offers an opportunity for an interviewer to work with a person with a brain injury to understand the characteristics and timing and nature of those injuries. Kim, did you want to say anything to tee up the OSU now that I'm put you on the spot?
Well, first of all, hi, everybody, and thank you to NASHIA for having us. What I'll say about the OSU is the backstory of this particular spinoff of the study was really a way to compare head-to-head, pardon the awful pun, the performance of these two instruments. So Anne had been using the HELPS, which is really the gold standard in IPV research to identify brain injury. And we've been working with John Corrigan for years on our research team. So we're Camp OSU, and we've revised the OSU like many other states here on the call today to include also a fourth step to identify non-TBI or acquired brain injuries. And this was a chance to pretty definitively look at the performance of these two instruments in a clinical setting against each other, and what kinds of data you might get and what you lose out with either one. So for anyone who is interested in like why you might use both, we used both to see which we ultimately liked better.
Thanks, Kim. So here's what we found so far. When we asked women early in the interview the HELPS items, you see quite a bit of detail here about which items they said yes to, and then combinations. When you look at women who indicated that they had a head injury or were seen in an emergency, were hit in the head or were seen in an emergency setting related to an injury to their head, plus a loss of consciousness, about 2/3 of women answered all of those questions together. So that, according to the HELPS, would be a good way to try to approximate somebody who may have had a mild brain injury, but wasn't, for example, seen right afterwards to get a thorough workup at the time for a brain injury. So this seemed to us on par with what we had seen in the triage study. That was 56% of women, that this 61 to 67%, depending on which items, looked like, again, a pretty significant concern about histories of potential mild brain injuries. When we turned to the OSU, where there was just more time to talk with people about their experiences, we saw an increase in the number of women who told us about some sort of blow to the head. And in particular, when we combined any blow to the head with an alteration in consciousness, the OSU tool identified about 80% of women. What we saw concerningly for trying to think about the severity of injury is that many women were reporting pretty significant injuries, with 1 in 5 women indicating a loss of consciousness of more than 30 minutes for at least one of those injuries. About half of women were reporting multiple injuries, and we frequently heard that there were multiple injuries in a short period of time, the cause being in those cases primarily domestic violence. And so the OSU offered us an opportunity in understanding more about the nature of the injuries, to get a sense of how much of these injuries were really driven by domestic violence, where it was an injury during the incident. Well, Kim alluded to a new exciting change in the OSU to get at strangulation. The version that we were using did not explicitly ask about strangulation. And so we do assume that this is an underestimate in capturing only external blows to the head. As we've seen in other studies, and as your communities are probably seeing across the country, those kinds of injuries go hand in hand with other co-occurring distress, that high degrees of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms as well as depression symptoms were common among the 100 women or so with whom we talked during this study. We also saw a lot, we took a look at the kinds of meaning making women were engaging in after traumas, asking them about things such as feeling shame or self-blame, fear, or betrayal. And those sort of post-traumatic appraisals, which are common across different kinds of traumas, were also common here. And I wanted to flag that because one of the most interesting things for folks on my team coming at this as trauma researchers was that the degree to which, like, we're used to asking people about all sorts of intimate details of their lives, of victimizations that were perpetrated against them. We're used to talking to women about shame and self-blame and difficult emotions. And what was so striking in this study was how additionally difficult it was for women to talk about the injuries to their brains and the perceptions for them of what had shifted about their sense of self and their own abilities. And we were also hearing from women about the ways that abusive partners were using cognitive or other kinds of changes in women against them, telling them that they wouldn't be believed, or they were the cause of problems because they didn't have their act together, or you could imagine any number of ways that the kinds of consequences of those injuries might be used against women. And so just wanted to note how striking that was to us. We were, as I said, really interested in what do you capture when you use an identification tool such as the OSU, as well as the HELPs. We were also interested in links to health service needs. This is not surprising. Remember, we were recruiting from women who were going to an agency to seek services, but did want to note, as women were moving through those doors, that they had many kinds of needs. They identified an average of 8 different health problems over the prior year, many unmet service needs. 1 in 5 said that they were not getting the care, the medical care that they needed at the time. Now, Kim and I usually run around together talking about all kinds of bad news related to these and related data. But we do try to find a spot of good news here and there to share with you. We had assumed going into the study that the combination of psychological consequences as well as perhaps brain injury consequences may make it difficult for women to build relationships and trust with providers, and may have consequences for health literacy. And that was not the case. We heard from women that when they were connected with providers, these were relationships that they had a lot of trust in, and they were navigating well things like medication instructions and stuff like that. So wanted to share a spot of good news. But moving quite quickly back to the bad news, we also tried to understand how the kind of combination, that the picture we were seeing of cognitive difficulties and some of the affective pieces I was explaining, whether together those things were linked with subsequent brain injuries. So remember back to that triage study, I mentioned, more than 1 in 2 had indicated a lifetime blow to the head that resulted in an alteration in consciousness, but those weren't all from injuries that occurred during domestic violence. And so one of the things that Kim and I and our teams have wondered is, might some of the consequences of brain injuries be something, regardless of their source, be something that potentially abusive partners are picking up on and taking advantage of and using to perpetrate victimization? And so what we saw in some preliminary data in this sample was that women who had reported more cognitive difficulties on that HELPS measure, those cognitive difficulties predicted 3 months later the likelihood of re-victimization, more additional instances of domestic violence. And so this to us is an avenue we're trying to explore in some current work, but really was stood out in a cautionary or concerning piece of evidence that the dysregulation tied to the brain injury may be something that abusive partners are taking advantage of. We also saw that about 10% of women whom we talked with 3 months later reported a new head injury, a new external blow to the head with alterations of consciousness. So in terms of multiple injuries to the brain in relatively short periods of time, this of course was of great concern to us to see. Kim and I both alluded to strangulation. At the OSU, as we said in the HELPS, did not explicitly capture that. We did ask women separately about instances of strangulation, and almost 70% of women said they'd been strangled by the intimate partner who, the domestic violence that led them to the Rosandom Center to seek services. That shocking statistic is in line with other studies nationally and a recent review of non-fatal strangulation in domestic violence. And so is an important additional source of injury to keep in mind as you think about identification as well as consequences of brain injury. Turn it over to Kim.
Awesome. So, Anne, thank you. And Maria, I think you wanted us to hold questions for the end, but there's some really great questions in the chat, and I'm excited to get to talk more about that and the mechanism of injury and why that might be so common. This is like a brief segue onto a soapbox that is familiar to a lot of you and perhaps doesn't go without saying for some other folks. So I'm making this point and underlining it here. In this study with Anne and I, we are studying women exposed to intimate partner violence by design. So that men can present for care with our partner at the Rosandom Center. And we did not recruit them into this particular study. So we were looking really specifically at the experience of women, and there's a reason for that. Everything we understand about women's brains suggests that they're unique. And Anne, if you would go to the next slide, some of you who have seen me present before will recognize this. I cribbed it from Amazon. It's totally cheeky and really meant to be a farce in some ways, because we know a lot about men's brains. And the statistic, this from just a few years ago, I think from 2019, was that women comprise 16% of all of the subjects in neuroscience research. Largely because we study populations of convenience, and men are overrepresented in contact sports and combat military settings. So we've studied a lot about men's injuries, and there has been a long-standing, like, field-wide assumption that the same injury dynamics and recovery dynamics apply for men and women. And of course, you might have a nascent thought in your brain that suggests that, but I wonder if they're different. And Anne, thanks for going to this slide. This is a colleague, Sonia Molieva in Canada, and Anne and I's good colleague in Boston reproduced this just a few years ago as a way to visually represent all of the reasons why women's brains might be different from men's brains, and their experience of brain injury from a physiological, a psychological, an environmental, and sociocultural perspective might be very different. And this seems like, shouldn't that go without saying? But if you can imagine that the the climate is such that even in 2021, we needed a visual reminder of all of the reasons to believe those things might be different. So this is me really poking fun at a field of inquiry that has lagged behind in terms of its recognition of gender differences. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that everything we know about injuries suggests that there's something unique for women. And I'm saying here, we're just really at the tip of the iceberg with understanding women's brain injuries. We have not even begun to understand the experience of people who are trans, and particularly for trans men who may share the same physiology. We know almost nothing about trans populations and gender non-binary folks. So there is an urgent press for research in those areas. And I'm just sharing this snapshot of what we think we know about women's injuries. Women have always reported being more symptomatic after even mild injuries. And many of you may have been party to conversations where we explained that as a product of gender roles and socialization, and that women are more disclosing of distress, and they're socialized to admit vulnerability, and they're less subject to a warrior culture that would have them kind of rub some dirt on it and walk away. So that has been the large cultural explanation for the fact that women are more symptomatic after injury. And very few people wondered if perhaps it might be that women are more symptomatic after injury. And there's a growing body of research to suggest that that's true. Women have a greater inflammatory response to injury. This is true as a evolutionary holdover of being more resilient to injury. But inflammation, of course, persistent inflammation is the downside of all of those persistent symptoms. So without going too far afield into neuroinflammation, understanding that inflammatory changes are probably the basis for things like PTSD and depression and risk for these other poor outcomes. So the inflammation that characterizes women's injuries uniquely may be also our downside. Women also have more cognitive complaints after injury. They have more suicidality complaints, which is a really big one when you look at this last point here, which is that about 1 in 2 women fails to access the care that they need. So the population of women with brain injury history is incredibly vulnerable. For women exposed to interpersonal violence who also have a brain injury, the commitment that Anne and I have made in this research is to really systematically identify the barriers to their care and to address them in a really global, systematic way. But just understanding that the landscape is that most women won't access the care that they need. And as you add suicidality and cognitive dysfunction, impulsivity to the mix, it gets really dangerous. The other point that I want to underline, and this from Molieva, also in Canada, this is a really important point. And we have a larger ongoing, maybe for 2 decades now, conversation about dementing disease and risk for early onset dementing disease being increased for people who are exposed to hundreds of thousands of subconcussive blows. Here, I mean professional athletes. And the risks, in fact, are that in that early onset dementing disease category, which is a very low frequency base rate group, it just so happens that that outcome is so spectacularly bad that we study it if it might be preventable in the research. Women are overrepresented in that small base rate. So the likelihood that women develop early onset dementia is much higher relative to their male counterparts. So again, it's a lightning strike for both groups, but the risk for women is very frank and shows up really consistently in the research. And if you would go to the next, this I am circling back to the population of vulnerable women exposed to violence-related brain injuries. So in the research, people who sustain a violence-related brain injury, not necessarily in the context of intimate partner violence, but it might be a physical assault from someone that you may not know, relative to people who sustain a brain injury through some other mechanisms, say by a fall or by a motor vehicle accident, have much poorer outcomes. So there's something about the dynamics of sustaining a violence-related brain injury that changes, it bends the curve for the trajectory after injury. So here we see some research coming out of Tamara Bushnick at Mount Sinai and some of her peers that suggests when you track folks in the long term relative to their differently injured peers, that their social productivity numbers are different. So they use public income sector funding. They're more likely to get divorced, which in the case of women exposed to intimate partner violence, of course, in some cases may be protective. And they have poorer social community integration. So if you think of the protective value of social support, they fail to access that benefit. And if you go to the next, here is just a quick shout out to a population of women that I've been studying for years that shows up as incredibly vulnerable in the context of a really vulnerable group of women. And that is women who are in the criminal justice system, so involved in the criminal legal system. If you look overall, obviously, you've all heard me say that the rate of brain injury is well overrepresented in the criminal legal system. It ranges somewhere between 35 and 97%, depending on the studies. And as we really commit to studying women in the criminal legal system, we start to identify some really interesting differences. So these overall, and then I'm going to share some of our data here from Colorado. As a rule, in the general population, men are much more likely to sustain a brain injury than women. And that difference goes away, that gender difference goes away in criminal legal settings, where the rate of brain injury history is actually higher among women in those settings. We spend a lot of time in this area of research, in criminal legal research and brain injury, searching for what a lot of people intuitively assume is a chicken and egg relationship, that you sustain a brain injury and your risk for involvement in the criminal justice system goes up. And the relationship there is actually really muddy and complicated. And for all the reasons that you might assume, those are all true. What is interesting, though, is that there is a more compelling case for chicken and egg relationship if you look just at women's experience. So the relationship between the temporal relationship, rather, between women's injury and first criminal offense is much tighter than is true for their male peers. And there's a relationship between the severity of injury and the severity of offense, which is not true in male populations. So again, like an early understanding, but the assumption that the general public makes about how we think about brain injury in criminal legal system actually appears only to apply potentially to women and not to men. And Anne, if you would, I think we go back one, and I can't remember. Okay, perfect. And back one more. Oh, back two more. Perfect, perfect. And the next one, and awesome. Oh, and one for the other way. Perfect, perfect. So here is a general reminder about this makes sense to everyone in this audience, but really I underline it at every opportunity when I talk about particularly women who are involved in the criminal legal system, that for most of them, their identity status, and this is true for male research subjects and participants and clients who are in the criminal legal system too, but it's almost never the case that they're in this single sphere of being an offender or perpetrating a crime, but rather to understand that their identity status, particularly for women, is almost always to have also been the victim of violent crime, and in the case of criminal justice, to have been convicted also of some crime. Okay, thanks, Anne. If you go to the next one. Okay, so 2 slides from our data here in Colorado, just to share and underline an important point. We looked at the kinds of injuries that characterized women in the criminal legal system. So these were women in jail and women in community corrections, so probation, parole programming. And what we found was that they were 6 times more likely to have multiple traumatic injuries related to violence than their male peers in the criminal justice system. Of course, going back to that point that Tamara Bushnick has made over and over again, which is that violence-related TBIs are associated with poor outcomes. What we found is drilling into the experiences of these women that they had longer total incarceration times, despite the fact that they did not have convictions of more violent offenses than their peers. So it suggested a picture of this kind of churn, the revolving door of criminal justice that many of you are familiar with, but that really typified the experience of women. And they were much more likely to sustain back-to-back injuries. And Anne, if you'll go to the next slide, apologies to everyone that this is so busy, but I am going to underline a few important points. This is a manuscript that we're putting together in real time right now that I'm really excited about, but we looked at the experience of women with a significant brain injury history relative to men with a significant brain injury history who are in criminal justice. So again, jails, and mostly jails and probation. Some are on parole. Women in that group, that already vulnerable group, were much sicker than their male peers. So they were much more likely to have one or more physical illnesses, much more likely to have a history of mental illness. Interestingly, what will take many of you back to like wandering uterus times is that when we looked at among men and women with brain injury history who had a mental illness, women were much more likely to be managed on psychiatric medications than their male peers, which I don't know why that smacks of hysteria to me, but it does. The risk for having at least one suicide attempt in their history was much higher. And this pattern of abuse was really evident in the women involved in criminal legal system with brain injury history. So childhood violence and to have been exposed to violence as an adult. And the most common mechanism of injury for both groups was assault. And then I paint this picture and the next slide, if you would, which is in so many ways, the experience of these women 6 times more likely to sustain violence-related multiple injuries and much more likely to sustain injuries in close succession to each other. And they describe themselves as sicker and have greater mental illness. They look like a cohort of retired NFL players from an injury and presentation perspective. And they don't have the benefit of all the protective services that we assume someone who is a retired professional athlete might have access to, much less the attention of the media or a national dialogue about how at risk they are from a brain health perspective. So Anne, thank you for that. And I've perhaps underlined the obvious, but happy to like draw attention to a group that really warrants some additional protections.
Awesome. Thanks, Kim. We wanted to pivot to a few implications that we see and then open things up. And starting with implications for thinking about the criminal legal world. And for those of you who have opportunities to work in collaboration with victim service agencies, we've been thinking a lot about victim advocacy and ways that the consequences of brain injuries may make it difficult for people to take advantage of services they may very well need after domestic violence. Some other work from our teams has shown that after domestic violence, people have just an enormous number of unmet needs, whether these have to do with legal needs or intersecting issues such as housing and food instability, economic and school impacts. And so being able to access and take advantage of victim advocacy can be really essential on the path to healing and recovery from domestic violence. And it's been my experience in the victim and in the criminal legal system that there are at times quick assumptions made about how victims and survivors interact with the system and explanations, which is just human tendency, right? When we look at somebody else, we have a tendency to think that the explanation for their behavior may be something about things like motivation. And some of those tendencies are really heightened when it comes to something like domestic violence. where there's sort of a cultural stereotype of victims as calling the police, but then not being willing to cooperate, for example. You may have seen that played out in any number of TV shows or movies, or heard such narratives at times in your own communities. And so thinking about even a simple example, like a victim or survivor not showing up to an interview or to a court proceeding, how quick we are sometimes in the legal system to use language like she's not cooperative, or she's not a good witness, or things along those lines. And I think as professionals with all of this expertise in terms of brain injuries, we're in a particularly important position to advocate for and help people understand how the consequences of brain injury may impact somebody's ability to navigate these complex systems that are really incredibly stressful. So we've been thinking about this in terms of implications for identifying brain injury and the kinds of tools that folks may use. And you've got some codes here to link to information about the HELPS or the OSU, if those are measures you're not familiar with and interested in learning about more about bringing some of those tools or recommending some of those tools to community partners and so forth. Of course, there's implications for support, and how do we identifying isn't necessarily the end all be all. It's identifying to what end to get to support. And so Kim and I and others have been thinking about how there are some straightforward things to take from the extensive literature and work that communities and researchers have done to think about basic accommodations or ways of adapting usual procedures in order to support people with brain injuries, making a point to to minimize distractions, to take breaks. But we wanted to caution also that some of the usual advice, such as make lots of reminder calls or write things down, that can have a different implication for safety when you're thinking about people being abused by an intimate partner who might intercept information, who might intercept phone calls. And so there has to be a way that we connect the wisdom of the brain injury field with the wisdom of the domestic violence field for really thinking about accommodations and support that are trauma-informed, that take into account the dynamics of abuse and allow us to, as I said, apply the wisdom of both worlds. We wanted to make a little shout out for our colleagues in Ohio who have done a lot to really champion moving from sort of a focus on universal identification of brain injuries to a focus on universal accommodation. So how can we in our communities be helping people understand the sort of accommodations that may be useful? And lots of organizations have developed or are developing these kinds of tools, including your own. But we wanted to acknowledge the work happening out of the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, and they've got some great resources with formatting that Kim and I covet for just making information very accessible and nice for thinking about accommodations. There are other kinds of resources, such as from the ABI Research Lab that has information about brain injury through the lens of what would, how could survivors use that information, as well as family and friends and loved ones. So again, a nice example of really connecting and blending these fields and so forth. We also see a lot of implications for coordinated care. And so again, thank you for this opportunity to talk with you and to think about how do we talk to allied professionals. In my own team's work on responding to domestic violence, we've known for a long time that the world is better when we are coordinating care in response to issues such as domestic violence and sexual assault, that there are measurable impacts down the road for survivors when we are able to work together and bring multidisciplinary expertise to the table to respond to the legal, social, psychological needs of victims and survivors. And so I think for me, before I hand over the soapbox to Kim for her to share her soapboxes of implications for you, I think my passion and wish has really been that we find this nexus of how to take what we know about brain injury and combine it with trauma-informed responses to make sure that we're pulling in knowledge about brain injury into coordinated care, that we're involving folks such as your agencies in community victim service responses, because it really is turning out to be a picture that is a puzzle that is only going to be really put together and addressed by taking from both of these traditions. So turn it over to Kim. Oh, you're on mute, friend.
Got it. Oh my God. I just had that moment to think, oh, mute. I'm going to make this last point, and this is maybe a commitment that we all share because everyone is here on the call and attentive to NASHIA's mission and really committed to doing this work. But all of you are lobbying for the kinds of insurance coverage, catastrophic care coverage, and the kinds of policies that would ensure that victims get screened. And I wanted to share one of our commitments in that kind of global commitment to doing better by survivors of brain injury is to really amplify the voices of people impacted by brain injury. And we've always been really deliberate in our efforts to promote self-advocacy as part of our screening model, and to arm people with strategies that they could use across settings. So we've always shared that. And I wanted to share one special story that came through the network that Anne and I share. This was a young woman. Her name is Melissa Bickford. She emailed from out of the blue and said, I have been abused for years. I have lots of brain injuries. I'm coming to realize that now. And how can I get involved? And I put her in touch with colleagues at the Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado and at NASHIA and with MindSource here in Colorado. And Melissa stayed in contact with me, and she felt really strongly that she was able to have a hand in community development across the board, but she hadn't had an outlet to tell her story. So I put her in touch with a good friend of mine at the Marshall Project. And if you aren't a subscriber to the Marshall Project blog, it's a totally brilliant long format journalism, not unlike the New Yorker magazine, but it specifically addresses criminal legal reform and social justice. So this is an article that Melissa wrote. This is her story in her own words on the Marshall Project. And she knows that I tell her story and has asked that I share it and get this distributed as widely as possible and to the people that you work with. It's so powerful, a reminder about why we're doing this work and how silent these voices have been in service, in research, and in the kinds of settings where they might be empowered to make a change, which they haven't been until now. Anne and I had the really great fortune to get to mentor Melissa in her commitment to making legislative change. So Melissa's experience was that she had been abused in a really horrifying way for years and years by several partners, but her most recent partner landed her in the hospital on several occasions, including several times where she was admitted for care. And her complaint was that no one ever had a conversation with her about brain injury. No one ever mentioned the word. No one ever talked to her about the consequences of brain injury or the ways that she might protect herself against the consequences of brain injury. And she went on to develop that same impulsive presentation and poor decision-making and got herself then involved in the criminal justice system. And she wanted to save people from having the same experience. So we helped her get connected with colleagues here to write, to craft, and run a piece of legislation that would require victims of violent crime be screened for brain injury history across settings. And this passed just last year and is really, I think, the most groundbreaking piece of legislative work in brain injury right now, importantly, because it allows us to screen for brain injury closer to the time of injury versus years down the road where we might find ourselves in behavioral health settings, in criminal legal settings. if we can help people access care at the time of injury, of course, then you bend that curve and you get them back on their feet quicker. So this is a really important victory. It's entirely Melissa's, and we just got to see her in action. And if you'd like more information about that bill, you could reach out to Ann and I, and we're happy to share that too. But please do share Melissa's story.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kim. So our last bit of business, and now open things up to questions, is just to thank many people involved in the work that we presented today, particularly funders in Colorado, MindSource, who funded some of the work that we talked about with the Rosa Andem Center. So without further ado, it looks like we've got some questions in the chat as well as in the Q&A. So thank you. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you. Incredible information. And I'm blown away by the gender injustice data. It is just incredible to me, the prevalence there and some of the inequity. I'm just going to start at the top of some of these. And really, I think with Tamara's question, why are blows to the head so common with victims of domestic violence?
I think in part they're common because it's the nature of physical violence in domestic violence. And I think for a long time we thought about that as a black eye or an injury to the jaw, and we're not conceptualizing that as also something that rattled the brain. I think too that we have in how we ask about domestic violence on some of our typical measures, again, these potential injuries to the brain were just masked. So you might ask somebody about an object being thrown at them or them being shoved, but there wasn't necessarily the follow-up to ask, did that object hit the head? Or when you were shoved, did you bang your head against a wall? And so this is so common because it is the nature of physical violence in some violent relationships. We're simply, I think, uncovering it and talking about it in a different way. So it's always been around as a strategy. If an abusive partner is using physical coercion, physical violence to coerce and control a victim, it's just part of the nature of the abuse itself.
And certainly still in it.
I'll add one thing, Maria, and I know this is your world too, but the inherently predatory nature of choking and strangulation and the inherent, like, much higher lethality outcomes for people who are choked by a partner. I'll tell, this is a super random story, but because you'll never hear about it anywhere else, I feel compelled to tell it. But I had a chance to be part of the 2020 episode on Gabby Petito. I felt really excited to have a conversation about how intimate partner violence is invisible and you won't know, and you have to be proactive and reach out. And right, everybody was gobsmacked. How did we not know? And it looks so shiny on social media. And I spent the whole day in New York City being filmed and making these points. And I thought in a very informed way. And in the police footage, the body cam footage of the police contact with Gabby at the time of their traffic stop, she made a gesture that he had come at her, and she made a gesture like this. So I had this whole conversation about the outcomes for women who are choked by a partner and their risk for dying by strangulation. And I said here in my 2020 interview, like, and if I had to guess, I will bet that she was strangled and that's how she died. This was, of course, before the autopsy report. And if she was strangled, and they couldn't use any of that because I talked about him as the perpetrator, and they were like, that can't be substantiated. And anyway, it's like the outcomes are so horrifying, particularly for these women who have been strangled, choked. Of course, the deficits associated with ABI are denser and in some cases harder to manage. So it's like such a gigantic red flag that I feel grateful we're finally able to like flag in our measurement too.
Definitely. And I see John Corrigan's put a comment in here about a study, an early study about some perpetrators intentionally hitting women in the head so their hair hides the bruising, which we have heard before, gruesome as it is. And Kelly, I see you have reiterated that. For the incarcerated women, what percentage of them were serving time for injuring or killing their perpetrators?
It's a great question. I don't know. We do not, and we could probably go back through and extract it from clinical interview data, but it wasn't something that we coded. What I will say is that the rate of violent offenses in a population of women was much lower. And for these women who shared a history of childhood violence, violence exposure as an adult, and multiple violence-related injuries, they were really typical of the churn of criminal justice. So very short stays in jail, longer community correction stays, followed by failure in community corrections programming, relapsing back to a jail setting, earning their way back out, and just kind of recycling in this really gruesome way that of course is typical of the criminal legal system and all of the brokenness of the system. But for these women, they're really the casualty of the churn of it, and their opportunity for meaningful outcomes is perhaps made better to the degree that we recognize their unique needs and advocate on their behalf.
Definitely. Brad asked if there are any studies currently looking at the relationship between partner violence and TBI for the trans women community. Do you know of anything?
I'm not aware of anything specifically. Kim and I are doing some new work that is inclusive of trans women. So we hope that portends more inclusive research going forward, where we have better answers to such important questions.
Right. And of course, everybody is on the same page with the risk for being exposed to violence, stranger violence, intimate partner violence, and death by violence is much higher for a population of trans folks.
Yeah. The study that you mentioned in preparation, do you know what journal is going to be publishing that?
Don't. We have been looking for the right fit, and this is a cautionary tale for overthinking something and like crafting it for years. Like completely up in your head about it. So in my mind, we were aiming for feminist criminology, and I think it isn't the best fit. But if someone has a suggestion or is an editor on journal, looking at you, John Corrigan, who might think that they've got a great home for it, I would love to talk more. It's so good. It's so brilliant a piece.
Awesome. I can't wait. So who can administer the brain injury interviews? Is there training required, or can a community health worker use them, or social worker?
You want to take that one?
Well, I could speak to the OSU, and having John here in the audience is amazing. We've been Team OSU all along, and largely because it's free, the training is free. You can visit the, if you just Google OSU TBI, you can find recorded videos that are very brief. We've used it in settings and trained law enforcement officers, probation officers, behavioral health professionals. We've trained social workers and caseworkers, and like you name it, we've trained lots of different professionals to use it. And it is easy. It's 5 minutes. Of course, we've bumped into all the limits of people who will do the math and say like, okay, well, if we use the OSU on everyone, the 22,000 people incarcerated in Colorado, that's 17 FTE just doing OSU in a year. And of course, like, you have to be thoughtful about what you have for bandwidth, but we have found it really straightforward in its training and use, and every bit of it is totally free. And states have always been so happy to share their version. So there's, Anne had a link to the Colorado version. We modified the scoring a bit. We published on not sporting. But most states now have added non-TBI or ABI, and there's some really like beautifully graphically designed versions out there in the world that I think NASHIA might be the hub and the keeper of those. And the helps is also like so easy and faster.
Yeah, the helps is also free and is typically used as more of a, it can also be used just as a questionnaire. One adds to a pile of intake questionnaires. I think that we found the symptom measures really helpful from the helps, but the OSU prompts and conversation just leads to a much better understanding of the injuries than what you get from the initial identification on the helps. I think Kim and I and our colleagues have been concerned about whether the helps might underestimate because people may not be thinking about the range of experiences that could qualify, if you will. Our colleague Julia Dimitrieva, who is the quite a statistical genius, is working some of the data that we talked about today, introduced today, to try to look at when you draw on items from each measure, do you have a better shot at identifying people who are having more distress or more service needs? And so more to come on that front. So Kim has recruited us all to Team OSU. We love it. And there wasn't really ever a burning conflict there. But we have t-shirts. But the helps is, I think, useful in some ways as well, in lots of ways as well.
We're Team OSU as well at NASHIA and have developed an online screening platform. I see Judy's put a link in the chat
OBIS, of course. Yeah.
That pairs it with the Mind Source Symptoms questionnaire. So ask the questions, give the strategies, which we really like. And someone in the chat pointed out that implementation of a safety plan is key. And that is a double-edged sword because often people have difficulty with that because of cognitive challenges, right?
Yeah, agreed. And being able to take into account the cognitive challenges as well as affect, perception of self and others. I think it's so important, the message of trusting survivors. Survivors are the experts on their experiences. And how do you also open and help people consider that there may be danger cues and so forth that the brain injury itself makes it difficult to identify. And that's a really careful and complicated balance, because I think there are many instances where we haven't trusted survivors' sense that danger is increasing and so forth. And so it's a complicated set of issues. And thank you for reinforcing the importance of safety planning. And I don't think it's exactly the same with and without brain injury. And that's the point of today and other conversations, to make sure we're grappling with this together.
And you might want to mention the book proposal, because it really explores that intersection of people working with brain injury survivors and the vast expertise of people working in the survivor world from a violence perspective, who could have this really fruitful conversation about managing BI survivors of violence.
Yeah. What Kim said, Judy Detmer and I have been putting our heads together to try to think about how do we develop one place where we can talk about and really grapple with the complexities of these issues together, because there's not a one-stop shop of just make this change and now our trauma-informed practice is brain injury informed, or vice versa. I think it's a lot more nuanced. So hopefully more to come on that from the three of us.
Right. I saw a couple of comments in the chat and a question about clients being referred from DV shelters, and almost none of them sought out treatment, even though they lost consciousness. There's a wonder if those were individuals caring for small children, which leads to a question in here about better informing child welfare practice. you know, in addition to the criminal legal system, because so many times people who survive intimate partner violence and become involved in child welfare. And, you know, that is a complex and convoluted system. Any comments there?
I couldn't agree more with the need for us to get this information in front of multiple audiences. And I think that really speaks to the importance of coordinated care and cross-training and absolutely folks are not passing through one door. And I think that's really my part of my takeaway when I think about offering services, whether somebody takes the opportunity to follow up on that service now or not. What we have seen in our work is the potential that they may later. So that initial introduction may not be the point that they elect to access services, but don't be discouraged. In some of our work on coordinated care, we looked at whether women got outreach from an organization or just, you know, a list of referrals. And we saw that outreach, even if women didn't take advantage of it, it had an impact a year later in being linked with lower PTSD symptoms and fear. And so the idea of offering services, showing our communities care, that's a way to express care, is to say our community has something to offer you, that actually has impact whether somebody gets directly to the service today or a year from now. And unfortunately, lots of us who make referrals, we don't ever get to hear the story from a year from now. But I can tell you from the survivor-focused work we've done that does happen. So please, I think a primary mantra for me beyond Team OSU is just keep opening doors. If we keep opening doors by making resources available to people, it's, I think, quite powerful and important.
Yeah, love that.
Definitely. Anything since the COVID pandemic that you've observed in this space? Any long COVID effects tied to what you guys discovered?
Well, it's not in this area, but we do, under our brain injury research umbrella here, have a long COVID study. And for anyone who maybe hadn't thought of it this way, it's very clear that COVID is a brain injury in all of its really signature inflammatory markers. And the ways that it interacts with brain injury history to confer risk for poor outcomes. Also, in another arm of our study, chronic Lyme disease looks just the same and acts the same, and contributes to the same kind of denseness of psychosocial vulnerabilities. So it is a really important, certainly salient in real time and increasing numbers consideration. And another that I made a point of with our North Dakota colleagues earlier last month is West Nile virus. Like where Colorado, of course, leads the country, but you know, you'll find brain injuries in all kinds of unlikely places, even for folks who don't describe a typical history. Maria, I had not underlined this, but Iowa is doing some really great work in the child welfare system. So FYI, there's probably some Iowa attendees here, and we've been party to their work, and just think of child welfare in so many ways. It's like the furthest upstream you can go in a criminal legal trajectory, so tertiary prevention for the parents and caregivers, but as close to primary prevention for the kids in that system as you can get.
They have, and that ACL TBI grantee work group created that child welfare guide that sits on the NASHIA website as we speak. I see
great.
Judy has put a link in the chat.
Awesome.
Thank you for that. It is a great resource, and I know they have more work, more information coming out about that. Thank you so much for highlighting that. I think we're out of time. I think I hit almost all the questions that we have. Thank you so much for sharing your passion and this work, and we are very excited to see where you guys head next. And before we leave, I'd be remiss if I didn't say thank you to all of you who have joined us for today's event and our series. Stay tuned for other training events that we have, like the two that you see on the left of your screen. trauma-informed meditation, breath work, and psychoeducation for brain injury. And then to round out our year, leading groups in virtual spaces, becoming a better facilitator, part 2. We will have a 2024 series, and I hope you stay tuned for that. We appreciate you spending time with us today. Don't forget to fill out your evaluation at the end of the webinar, and have a great day.
Yay. Maria, thanks. Thanks, Nasha. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you.
Thanks all.